Before we speak of death, we must speak of permission, because nothing you are about to hear was hidden, and nothing required secrecy. The cruelty was not whispered, it was written. It was stamped, it was defended in courtrooms, preached from pulpits, and insured by the British Crown. So here is the question that should make you uncomfortable within the first 30 seconds. What does violence become when the law itself calls it order? The sun rose early on British plantations long before abolition, in the decades when British slavery was still considered lawful commerce. In places like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua, the day did not begin with birdsong. It began with iron, chains shifting, doors opening, feet touching dirt already warm from yesterday's heat. The air smelled of sugar, rot, sweat, and boiling molasses. It clung to the lungs. Silence was enforced, not requested. Talking before the bell was punished. Looking up without permission was punished. Existing too slowly was punished. This was not chaos. This was a system. Plantation cruelty was not accidental. It was designed. British law did not see people here. It saw property. Enslaved Africans were counted beside cattle and tools, listed in ledgers with prices and appreciation values. A human life could be insured, mortgaged, inherited, or destroyed without trial. If a slave died from punishment, exhaustion, or illness, the question was never moral. It was financial. How much had been lost? Could compensation be claimed? British slavery before abolition was not driven by rage alone. It was driven by paperwork. The plantation itself was built like a machine. Fields stretched endlessly under the sun, rows cut with mathematical precision. Overseers stood where they could be seen but not reached. Whips were not only for pain, they were for sound. The crack carried across the fields as a reminder that the law was present. Even when no one was being struck, the noise alone kept bodies moving. This was psychological terror refined over decades. Fear was cheaper than chains. At the center of this world stood the master's house, elevated slightly, cleanly painted, often white. From its windows the entire plantation could be surveyed like a map. The master did not need to shout. The system spoke for him. British law declared him owner not only of labor, but of time, movement, family, and breath. Religion reinforced it. Many masters believed sincerely that God had placed them there. Sunday sermons spoke of obedience. Scripture was quoted selectively. Silence was called virtue. The master was not born cruel. He was shaped, often educated in Britain, trained in commerce, law, or theology. He arrived on the plantation carrying the empire with him. His authority was reinforced by courts that favored property over people, by militias ready to suppress rebellion, and by a global economy that rewarded sugar with wealth and prestige. If he punished, it was called discipline. If he starved, it was called management. If someone died, it was called loss. Enslaved people were not addressed by names. They were referred to by age, strength, and usefulness. Field hands, house servants, breeders, invalids. Children were assigned value before they could speak. Mothers were separated from infants without explanation. Husbands and wives could be sold apart with no appeal. British slavery depended on emotional severance. Attachment created resistance. Fear created obedience. Punishment was public by design. Whippings took place where others could hear them, even if they could not look. The body learned quickly what the eyes were forbidden to see. Scars were not hidden. They were warnings. The absence of reaction was learned behavior. Screaming invited more pain. Silence became survival. At night, the plantation did not rest. It listened. Every sound carried meaning. A cough could be sickness or weakness. Footsteps could be inspection or capture. Darkness did not belong to the enslaved. It belonged to patrols, dogs, and the constant threat of being accused of something unnamed. British plantation cruelty thrived on uncertainty. You were never told the rules completely. That way you were always breaking them. Inside the master's house the rules shifted, but the danger deepened. Enslaved people who worked indoors moved through quieter spaces, but silence here was heavier. Every object was polished, every gesture was watched. Mistakes were remembered. Punishment did not always happen immediately. Delay was another weapon. The knowledge that harm could arrive later unexpectedly was often worse than the harm itself. The bedroom was the most private space, and therefore the most dangerous. Power concentrated there. Authority without witnesses. British law did not recognize violations committed by masters against enslaved people. What happened in those rooms did not exist on paper. Silence was not just enforced, it was required. And yet within this system of absolute control, death still found its way in. Not loudly, not heroically, not with speeches or rebellion. Sometimes it came quietly, through neglect, through exhaustion, through something small and overlooked, something that did not look like resistance at all. Because when a system believes itself untouchable, it stops watching closely. And that is where this story truly begins. If you want, I'll continue directly with Section 2 in the same style, moving deeper into the master's daily life and the quiet mechanics of control. The master woke each morning believing order was natural, not because he was cruel by instinct, but because the world around him confirmed it. The plantation ran as it had the day before, and the day before that, without requiring his constant attention. Bells rang, bodies moved, crops were cut, punishments were administered on schedule. British slavery worked best when the master did not have to raise his voice. His authority was embedded into routine. He dressed slowly, deliberately. Linen shirts imported from England, polished boots made for heat he never truly felt. From his window he could see the fields already alive with motion, dark figures bent low under a sun that had barely risen. He did not see individuals. He saw productivity. The law had trained him to see it that way. Ledgers recorded output, not suffering. When he reviewed accounts, human beings appeared only as costs and returns. British plantation cruelty was not chaotic brutality. It was efficiency. He told himself he was responsible for these people, that without him they would fall into disorder, starvation, or savagery. This belief was not questioned. It was reinforced by other planters, by colonial officials, by letters from home praising the sugar shipments that enriched the empire. In Britain, refined tables sweetened tea with the product of this land. Distance softened the truth. The further the consumer, the cleaner the conscience. Religion played its role quietly but firmly. The master attended church when convenient. He listened to sermons about hierarchy, obedience, and divine order. He did not see contradiction. The Bible, as it was taught to him, placed every being in a rank, kings above subjects, masters above servants, slaves below both. This was not preached with anger. It was preached with calm certainty, the same certainty that allowed him to sleep at night. When punishment was required, he rarely carried it out himself. Delegation preserved dignity. Overseers existed to absorb the ugliness. Men hardened by proximity to pain, paid to ensure discipline never weakened. If an enslaved person collapsed from exhaustion, it was recorded as laziness. If someone resisted, it was recorded as defiance. The master rarely questioned these reports. To question them would be to question the system that sustained him. The plantation had rules that were never written down, only learned through consequences. Enslaved people learned them quickly. Do not meet the master's eyes unless spoken to. Do not walk too slowly. Do not walk too fast. Do not speak unless necessary. Do not forget your place. The master did not need to explain these rules. British slavery depended on self-regulation through fear. The most effective control was the kind that lived inside the body. Children learned earliest. They watched adults flinch at footsteps, fall silent at shadows. They learned that crying brought attention, and attention brought pain. British plantations raised children into silence as carefully as they raised sugarcane. The master rarely thought about this. Children were future labor. Their value increased with age. Their emotions were irrelevant. Inside the house, enslaved servants moved like ghosts. Their presence was required, but their existence was not acknowledged. They learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Water refilled before glasses emptied, floors cleaned before dirt was visible. The master took this as proof of proper management. He did not ask how such obedience was achieved. He did not need to. British law had already answered that question for him. The bedroom remained the core of his authority. It was the space where he removed the performance of civility required in public. There his word was absolute. There were no witnesses who mattered, no records, no accountability. What happened in that room never reached the ledgers. Silence was total, enforced not by chains but by the knowledge that no one would listen. The enslaved learned which moods were dangerous. A bad harvest, a letter from Britain, a rumor of rebellion on another island. These moments tightened the atmosphere. Punishments increased. Inspections became more frequent. British slavery responded to fear with pressure. When the empire felt threatened, bodies absorbed the anxiety. Resistance, when it existed, was rarely loud. Open rebellion was crushed quickly and publicly. The cost was too high. Instead, resistance lived in smaller spaces. Slowed movements, feigned illness, broken tools. Knowledge passed quietly from one person to another. What plants could heal? Which overseer drank too much? Which moments were least observed? Survival required intelligence. Endurance required memory. The master noticed none of this, or if he did, he dismissed it as coincidence. The system reassured him constantly. If something went wrong, it was blamed on the enslaved themselves, their nature, their supposed inferiority, their imagined moral failings. British slavery required dehumanization not just to justify violence, but to prevent doubt. At night, when the plantation settled into uneasy quiet, the master slept behind thick walls. He believed himself safe. Dogs patrolled. Men stood guard. The law stood behind him like an invisible army. He did not consider the possibility that danger could come from within the order he trusted. The idea seemed absurd. Property does not act. Tools do not plan. Silence does not speak. And yet every system that depends on silence eventually misunderstands it. Silence can mean submission, but it can also mean observation, waiting, learning. The master believed he knew everything that mattered about the people who lived and worked under him. Their strength, their usefulness, their limits. He never asked what they noticed. He never imagined that the same stillness he demanded could become a shield, that the same obedience he enforced could become invisibility. British slavery trained enslaved people to disappear in plain sight, to move without leaving traces, to exist without recognition. It was meant to erase them. But erasure has consequences, because when you are forced to live without being seen, you learn how to see everything else. And somewhere within the walls of that house, within the routines he trusted, something was being learned that he could not read in any ledger. By the time the plantation reached its full rhythm, the enslaved no longer measured time by days. They measured it by endurance, by how long the body could continue before it failed. Morning blurred into heat, heat blurred into pain, pain blurred into routine. British slavery depended on this erosion. When suffering becomes normal, it stops being questioned. On paper, the enslaved existed only as entries, numbers assigned to rows, values adjusted for age and strength. A man in his 20s was listed higher than a woman past childbearing age. A child was an investment, not a responsibility. Injuries were noted only if they reduced output. Death was recorded with a line drawn through a name and a recalculation of loss. Plantation cruelty was hidden behind arithmetic. In the fields, work never paused for grief. If someone collapsed, others stepped around the body until an overseer decided whether it could still move. If it could not, it was dragged aside. The sun did not slow, neither did the whip. British plantations ran on the assumption that labor was infinite, because people were replaceable. Ships arrived regularly. Human cargo replenished what the land consumed. Public punishment served a purpose beyond pain. It created memory. The body remembered even when the mind tried to forget. Whippings were counted aloud. Each strike was deliberate. The sound mattered as much as the wound. Children learned to count before they learned to read. Silence followed each punishment, thick and absolute. No one comforted the injured. Comfort could be interpreted as sympathy. Sympathy could be interpreted as defiance. Fear was managed carefully. Too much fear caused rebellion. Too little caused disobedience. British slavery refined terror into balance. Punishment was unpredictable enough to keep everyone alert, but routine enough to feel inevitable. This was psychological control perfected over generations. Inside the quarters, nights were not restful. Bodies ached. Insects fed freely. Conversations happened in whispers, if at all. Names were spoken quietly, like secrets. Stories of home survived only in fragments. Language itself was dangerous. Overseers listened. Informants existed. Trust was a risk calculated daily. Families were fragile arrangements. They existed only as long as they were useful. A mother could be sent to another plantation without warning. A child could be reassigned as property before learning who their father was. British slavery broke bonds deliberately. Love created loyalty. Loyalty threatened ownership. The house servants lived closer to the master, but distance did not equal safety. Proximity meant exposure. Every movement was observed. Every mistake magnified. The punishment for indoor failure was often delayed, delivered privately, without witnesses. Silence again. The law did not require explanation. Certain spaces on the plantation carried unspoken dread. Storage rooms, the yard where punishments occurred, the path leading to the master's house, and most of all, the rooms upstairs. The enslaved learned when to avert their eyes, when to disappear, when to make themselves smaller. British law offered them no protection there. What happened behind closed doors did not exist unless the master chose to speak of it. Yet even in this controlled world, cracks formed. Not dramatic ones. Small, almost invisible. A tool left slightly dull. A task done slower than expected. An illness exaggerated. Knowledge of plants shared quietly. Which roots numbed pain. Which leaves upset the stomach. Which mixtures caused weakness that looked like natural sickness. This knowledge did not come from books. It came from survival. The master believed order was complete, that his authority reached every corner. But authority relies on understanding, and British slavery never truly understood the people it claimed to own. It mistook silence for emptiness, stillness for ignorance, obedience for loyalty. In truth, silence carried everything: observations, resentment, calculation. The enslaved watched patterns closely. Who entered which rooms? What was eaten? What was discarded? What was cleaned carelessly? What was trusted too easily? The plantation trained them to notice details, because noticing was how you stayed alive. Death was common enough that it no longer shocked, but it was expected to come from the fields, from punishment, from exhaustion, not from inside the house, not from within the master's private world. That space was assumed secure, protected by walls, law, and belief. British slavery never considered that the same system that reduced people to property also placed them everywhere. In kitchens, in bedrooms, in storage rooms, in silence. The enslaved were invisible, but they were present, constantly, watching, and somewhere within that presence, within that enforced quiet, the idea took shape not of rebellion, not of justice, but of inevitability. But the master, like everyone else, depended on a body, on breath, on sleep, on routines he never questioned. The plantation taught this lesson without meaning to. Power always forgets its own dependence, and forgetting is dangerous. The bedroom was not the largest room in the house, but it was the most powerful. It was where authority no longer needed witnesses. The door closed, and with it, the last illusion of restraint. British slavery did not need to describe what happened in that space, because the law had already decided it did not matter. What could not be reported could not be punished. Silence was the final protection. The room smelled of clean linen and heat trapped in stone walls. Windows were shuttered against insects and prying eyes. At night, the plantation beyond the house went dark, but this room remained separate from that world. It was insulated from screams, from bells, from the sound of labor. The master slept, believing himself removed from the system he controlled, as if power could be paused with rest. Enslaved servants entered this room with lowered eyes and measured steps. They learned quickly what was expected and what was dangerous. A glass of water left too long, a stain not fully removed, a pause that lasted a second too long. Punishment here did not need spectacle. It needed only memory. British slavery relied on the fear of what might happen more than what already had. The master trusted certain servants more than others. Trust in this system did not mean respect, it meant usefulness, it meant invisibility. Those assigned to the inner rooms were chosen because they spoke little, moved quietly, and blended into routine. Their silence was mistaken for emptiness, their obedience for absence of thought. The routines of the bedroom were predictable: night meals, washing, preparation for sleep, items placed where the master expected them. He did not inspect closely, he did not imagine risk. Why would he? The law stood with him, the empire stood with him. Even death, he believed, belonged to the fields, not to him. Plants entered the house every day for food, for decoration, for medicine. The plantation depended on them. Leaves boiled for fever, roots crushed for pain. Infusions prepared by enslaved hands under instruction passed quietly between generations. British masters used this knowledge freely while denying its source. They trusted it without understanding it. The bedroom was no exception. A sleeping draught, a tonic for the heat, a remedy for restlessness. Natural solutions were preferred to imported ones. They were cheaper, familiar, and considered harmless. No one questioned what they did not fear. What the master did not understand was that knowledge could exist without permission, that the same plants that healed could weaken, that effects could be slow, that symptoms could resemble common illness. British medicine at the time was limited. Fever, weakness, breathlessness, these were ordinary occurrences in tropical colonies. Death rarely demanded investigation. The enslaved who moved through the bedroom learned its rhythms. When the master slept deeply, when he woke restless, when he dismissed servants early, when he drank more than usual. This knowledge did not announce itself as intent. It accumulated quietly, like everything else in plantation life. No dramatic act occurred, no sudden confrontation. British slavery did not produce heroes, it produced survivors. If something was done, it was done small enough to be invisible. An extra leaf. A change in preparation, a moment that could be dismissed as error. Silence protected both the act and the actor. When the master began to weaken, no alarm sounded. He complained of fatigue, of heat, of unease in the chest. These were not unusual. Many masters suffered in the colonies. The environment itself was considered hostile. Nature, not people, was blamed. Servants continued their duties unchanged. Faces neutral, movements precise, no celebration, no visible reaction. British slavery had trained them too well for that. Any deviation would be noticed. Any emotion could be interpreted as guilt. The bedroom remained quiet, too quiet, sleep lengthened, breath shortened. The master's body betrayed him slowly, without drama, no final words, no realization, just decline. And when death came, it arrived without meaning. A body found still in a bed that symbolized control. A man who believed himself untouchable, undone by something ordinary. Something that left no mark, no evidence, no story that could be told aloud. The plantation did not change immediately. Bells still rang. Labor continued. Overseers barked orders. British slavery absorbed death as it absorbed everything else. The system did not pause for reflection. No accusation was made, none could be. The law did not imagine such a possibility. Property could not act with intent. Silence again, but something had shifted, even if no one named it. The bedroom, once the safest space, now carried uncertainty. The routines that had felt permanent were suddenly fragile. Control, it turned out, depended on belief. And belief, once disturbed, does not fully recover. The master's bed was stripped, the room cleaned, life continued. But the quiet there was no longer empty. After the master's death, no truth was sought. There was only procedure. A doctor was summoned, brief and indifferent, accustomed to colonial deaths that required no explanation. The heat was blamed, the climate, the strain of management. British plantations consumed men as efficiently as they consumed labor. The body was examined only long enough to confirm that it no longer worked. No inquest followed. None was required. British law did not investigate the deaths of masters unless another white man accused another white man. Enslaved people could not testify. Their words carried no legal weight. Even suspicion would have required imagination, and imagination was dangerous to a system that depended on certainty. The death was recorded, property reassigned, instructions sent to Britain, sugar production resumed. Grief, if it existed, was private and brief. The Empire had little patience for pause. British slavery survived individual loss easily. The system was the inheritance. The bedroom was sealed for days, then reopened. New linen, rearranged furniture. The smell faded. The silence remained. Servants returned to their routines, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in posture. No one asked questions. No one offered answers. The safest response was stillness. Rumors moved quietly, never aloud. A glance held a second longer. A pause before entering the room. Nothing that could be named. British plantations thrived on the absence of language. Without words, there could be no accusation. Without accusation, there could be no threat to order. The overseers tightened discipline. Death always made authority nervous. Whippings increased. Inspections became harsher. Control responded to uncertainty with force. British slavery did not tolerate mystery. It tried to beat it out of the land, out of the bodies that worked it. But mystery does not disappear under pressure. It withdraws. It learns. The enslaved returned to the fields, to the kitchens, to the quiet interior spaces where they had always existed without recognition. Their lives continued in exhaustion and fear, as they had before. Nothing improved. Nothing was corrected. No justice emerged from the event. That was never its purpose. If something had been done, it was not spoken of, not celebrated, not remembered openly. Survival under British slavery required erasure, even of one's own acts. Silence protected more than the master ever understood. The plantation passed to another owner, a relative, an investor, someone trained in the same assumptions, the same laws, the same moral distance. British slavery did not end with one death. It continued uninterrupted, confident in its righteousness. Years later, abolition would come on paper. Laws would change. Compensation would be paid to slave owners, not to the enslaved. The system would rename itself, reshape itself, but never truly account for what it had allowed. British civilization would move forward without looking too closely back. The bedroom remained just a room. Its walls held no record, no confession, no acknowledgement. History did not mark it. Archives did not preserve it. The Empire did not learn from it. And that is the final discomfort of this story. Not that a master died. Masters died often, but that within a system built on absolute control, something happened that required no rebellion, no speech, no justice, only silence. The same silence British slavery had demanded from the beginning. Because when cruelty is legal, resistance does not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like routine, like obedience, like nothing at all. And that is why this story ends without comfort, without punishment, without resolution, not because nothing happened, but because the system was never designed to see it. The plantation did not collapse after that death. The fields did not burn. The bells did not stop. Sugar continued to flow across the Atlantic, sweetening cups of tea in London drawing rooms, funding banks, universities, and cathedrals. British slavery did not end with a quiet act in a quiet room. Systems like this are not undone by silence. The story of the bedroom was never written down. It was never debated in Parliament. It never reached abolitionist newspapers. It never became a case study in morality. It existed only in the memories of those who were legally forbidden from speaking. And memory, under British slavery, was dangerous. The enslaved learned early that survival meant erasing evidence of thought, to appear empty, to appear obedient, to appear incapable of intention. This performance protected them. It also made them invisible to history. When historians later searched for resistance, they found rebellions, revolts, and riots. They found speeches and pamphlets. They found petitions and testimonies recorded after abolition. What they rarely found were the quiet acts, the invisible calculations, the moments when power failed not through uprising but through overconfidence. British plantation cruelty depended on visibility, on spectacle, on loud discipline. It did not imagine resistance could be invisible. The master's death became a statistic, another colonial casualty in a climate known for disease. The Caribbean was called a graveyard for Europeans. That explanation required no moral reflection. It required no systemic reform. It required no acknowledgement of what slavery had done to the people who lived and died there in uncounted numbers. British civilization congratulated itself on order, on law, on progress. But the law had written ownership into human flesh. Progress had been built on exhaustion. Order had been maintained through terror. The bedroom, the plantation, the empire, all were connected by paperwork and silence. When abolition came in 1833, it came without confession. Compensation was paid not to the enslaved, but to the enslavers. The empire thanked itself for ending what it had created, without accounting for what it had normalized. Plantations continued under new names. Labor continued under new contracts. Power shifted in language, not in structure. The silence continued. The enslaved who had lived through those years rarely left records. Many could not write. Many were never asked. Many had learned that speaking invited harm. Their descendants inherited land that remembered, but archives that forgot. British history books would later frame abolition as moral triumph, not as overdue correction. The bedroom was never mentioned again, and yet it represents something uncomfortable. A system built on total control still depended on the people it claimed to control. The master ate food prepared by enslaved hands, slept in rooms cleaned by enslaved hands, drank medicine mixed by enslaved hands. His comfort, his safety, his very survival depended on those he believed incapable of intention. British slavery required proximity. Unlike distant factories, plantations forced enslavers and enslaved into intimate space. That intimacy produced terror, but also observation. The enslaved learned every habit, every weakness, every routine. Knowledge flowed one way. Authority assumed ignorance. Ignorance created vulnerability. The master believed silence meant loyalty. He believed obedience meant acceptance. He believed fear meant control. He did not understand that fear also produces calculation, that silence is not emptiness, that obedience is not absence of thought. The system never understood this. Even abolitionists often imagined enslaved people as victims waiting to be rescued, rather than as individuals constantly negotiating survival within impossible conditions. British narratives preferred moral clarity over uncomfortable complexity, but history is not clean. This story does not offer justice. It does not offer heroism. It does not offer closure. If something was done, it was done without celebration. If nothing was done, the possibility itself is enough to disturb the myth of total control. Either way, the system continued, and that is the real horror. British slavery was not only about chains and whips. It was about rooms and routines, about paperwork and sermons, about belief systems that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty without feeling monstrous. It was about silence enforced until silence became survival. The plantation existed because millions of people accepted its products and profits. The master existed because law, religion, and empire told him he should. The enslaved existed in history only when they were loud enough to be recorded. But most of their lives were lived in quiet. The bedroom stands as a symbol of that quiet, a private space within a public system, a space where power felt absolute, a space where law never entered, a space where silence ruled. And silence, in the end, is what history inherited. No memorial marks that room. No plaque explains what might have happened there. No textbook names the people who cleaned it, walked through it, feared it, observed it. Their stories dissolved into the plantation soil, into the sugar that traveled across oceans, into the wealth that built modern nations. British slavery ended legally. Its consequences did not. The master's bed was replaced. His name faded from plantation records. His descendants inherited money. The enslaved inherited nothing but memory, and memory, when unsupported by records, is easy to dismiss. So this story ends where it began, with permission, with law, with a system that allowed cruelty to be routine and silence to be survival, a system that taught people to disappear and then pretended they had never been there. The question remains, unanswered and uncomfortable, What does violence become when the law calls it order, and what does resistance become when silence is the only language allowed?